Good evening, and welcome to the Dole Institute of Politics for our first program of the year to discuss the value of free speech on college campuses. It is so wonderful to see so many new and returning faces to start off this semester. My name is Abby Clemens, and I'm a senior studying political science, digital marketing communications, and history, and I have the honor of serving as the Student Advisory Board Coordinator here at the Dole Institute this year. The Student Advisory Board, or SAB, is the official student group at the Dole Institute. We believe that politics is a place for people to connect across differences and party lines. Our members have access to many wonderful opportunities throughout the year, such as networking with our guests and volunteering at programs. We have many exciting events coming up throughout the semester, which some of our student workers will tell you about in just a few minutes. Our first meeting will be on February 3rd at 5:30 p.m. here at the Dole Institute. We will be discussing our exciting slate of events and opportunities for the semester. More spring programming dates are on the back of your programs that are at your tables, so check that out and feel free to take a photo. If you haven't already joined our GroupMe or newsletter, QR codes will be available at the check-in table back there, or you can talk to any of our student workers here at that table. Now, if you could please join me in welcoming our director, Audrey Coleman.
Thanks, Abby. Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the Dole Institute. On behalf of the Dole Institute, we're happy you're here. I, too, tonight am a guest of Abby Clements and the Student Advisory Board, so thanks for letting me into your space. I'm so proud of our student leadership. Abby is one of our fantastic cohort of leaders here at the Student Advisory Board, and they have built really a tremendous and vibrant student organization that I hope you all will consider being a part of. You'll hear a lot about opportunities to engage in programming, but one thing that I know is really important for the spirit of the Dole Institute is that in the Student Advisory Board, so much of the programming is designed and built at the inspiration and whatever the interest of the Student Advisory Board is. So if you're interested in being a part of a group like that you can not only attend and get some great food, but actually shape the conversation here on campus and at the Dole Institute, then I encourage you to come back again and see us. We're happy you chose to be with us this evening on this cold night. You've got some warm food. We've got a really fantastic, rich program to engage you intellectually in just a few minutes. But now it's my honor to turn it over to a couple of our student leaders, Ava and Jacob, I believe. You're up. Ava and Jacob are our discussion group coordinators this semester.
Hello, my name is Jacob McCarty, and I'm one of the discussion group coordinators, like she said. I wanted to share a little information about our upcoming series this semester, Politics Unplugged. Politics Unplugged is an off-the-record discussion group series about current political topics, and this semester it will be moderated by Jerry Seib. Jerry was a journalist for the Wall Street Journal for almost 45 years. He also served as the journal's executive Washington editor. As you can tell on your little program right here, it will be on Mondays, the first one being February 16th, and they start at 5:30, and dinner is provided. And if you are interested, we will send those RSVPs out here soon.
Hi, I'm Ava Levin, one of the other discussion groups coordinators at the Dole Institute of Politics. We have a very exciting discussion group series planned for this semester. For those who don't know, discussion groups are a program with a Republican and Democratic guest who facilitate a discussion. You may recognize one of our guest speakers, Jeff King, who led Politics Unplugged last semester and has previously served as a Dole Fellow. He is a former Kansas senator and served as chair of the Senate Judiciary. The other guest is Mark McCormick, a New York Times bestselling author and experienced reporter, editor, and columnist. Mr. McCormick also served as deputy director of the ACLU of Kansas and as executive director of the Kansas Black Leadership Council. The semester is unique because it will shift towards a discussion focusing on political philosophy. The first program is Wednesday, February 11th at 4 p.m. on life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Refreshments are provided, and frequent participation may lead to an exclusive dinner invite with the guests. Now, I'd like to introduce AJ to talk about pizza and politics. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. I'm AJ Mosier. I'm the Pizza and Politics Coordinator. Pizza and Politics is a student-centered program focused on making civil and political discussions engaging and accessible. Throughout the semester, I'll be bringing in experts to discuss a timely issue and connect it back to the student body. Students of all areas of study and interests are encouraged to come with questions and enjoy free pizza, of course. That's a really good benefit. The first program is going to be Friday, February 6th from 12 to 1. The topic is, Will AI Replace Our Jobs?, where I'll talk with Dr. Becca Selby-Leach. She is the director for the Center of Economic, Developmental, and Business Research. And we're going to talk about how AI is going to impact the job market for postgraduates, something I think that we're all very anxious to know. We're going to be in Alderson Auditorium in the Union, but stay tuned because this location will change for different programs throughout our semester. So make sure to check Rock Chalk Central and our Dole SAB Instagram for updates about that. Now I'm going to hand things over to our SAB coordinator, Abby Clements.
Although one of our guests, Jacqueline, couldn't join us tonight due to a canceled flight, we were still so fortunate to have Max here today to share his expertise with all of you. So can you give him a warm welcome? Well, I'd like to start out today by talking a little bit more about your background. So could you tell us what first interested you in First Amendment rights advocacy and law?
Well, I think it's fair to say that one of the things that has always motivated me has, even since I was a kid, was fairness. You know, this idea of fairness, and so there's a lot of different ways to think about how to make things fair through the law. And so I think that in that sense, the law school is probably preordained, right? The need to arbitrate, right? The need to figure out what is fair, what's not fair. Right and wrong is a little pejorative. We probably don't want to say that, but certainly what has merit and what doesn't. What's meritorious, what's not. I think that lawyers who do their whatever field a lawyer enters, I'm sure they're going to be very protective of that and say that that's the best field that to get their motivations out and their message out and to be able to assist clients in a way that makes sense for them and for their clients. But I think, as a roundabout way of answering your question, media law and the First Amendment and civil rights in general and the Constitution, I mean, this is the essence of fairness. The way that our government is set up, the fact that the Bill of Rights was enacted, the Constitution did not have these very important things that we sort of take for granted these days. Freedom of speech, freedom of the press. I mean, these are the sort of phrases that just get built into the American zeitgeist. And so when it comes to trying to resolve the question of what's right, what's wrong, what's fair, what's not, media law provides a very fertile ground for these issues to come up, because what media is essentially pop culture, isn't it? I mean, that's how pop culture is created, by what is what's in People magazine or National Enquirer or any sort of website that is often visited or has news. I mean, Facebook, social media. I mean, the way that we acquire information on the internet and through the media is really part and parcel to how our society works. And so being on the cutting edge of how people relate to each other, that's really what it comes down to. And I don't think I would have been able to articulate that when I was in law school or anything like that. But looking back on it now, I think that's the answer to your question.
Okay, well, awesome. And then before we get too into the topic of tonight, I'd like to just kind of set a baseline of like what the First Amendment is. So could you tell us a little bit about what the First Amendment is and what it protects?
Sure. So, the very first thing to remember, and this sounds, I think this is a very rudimentary concept, and I think that in the abstract it's easy to understand, but I think that, when we see so much speech and expression online, particularly social media, it can be hard to understand and draw the line between what's appropriate, what's not appropriate. That's of course a very a loaded word, as I think I'll be able to try to explain. But fundamentally, what the First Amendment does is it protects citizens is also a loaded word, but let's just say it protects folks who are living in the United States, and it protects them from government restrictions on their speech. That's the key limit to it, though. If it's a private actor, a corporation, individuals, those folks, if they're not state actors, if they're not working for the government, or if they aren't officially representing a government agency, the First Amendment does not apply. So it's really important to, so if you're in an argument with folks on social media, it's inaccurate to say, I have a First Amendment right to respond to you, or you're infringing on my First Amendment rights because you're trying to shut me down. That's not how it works. That's not what it is. The First Amendment is what it does is it makes it so that there are a limited categories and limited mechanisms by which the government can regulate expression. That is what the First Amendment protects. And so when we're thinking about the First Amendment, I think the best way to kind of illustrate what amounts is protected, what is considered protected speech and what is not, I think it's by example. I think we need to look at examples, because I think that we'll find that there are some very extreme examples and things that perhaps we would think to ourselves, oh, that's inappropriate, or boy, that person was really wrong. Or most importantly, perhaps, that person was really offensive. That person really offended me. But yet somehow that speech is protected, and why is that, and what are examples of that? I'll just list a couple of important ones to try to illustrate these differences. So the one that is perhaps the Supreme Court precedent that is perhaps closest to home here in Lawrence has to do with the Westboro Baptist Church. And so and this used to be a bigger factor a decade or so ago. The patriarch of that church passed away, and so that whole thing has been less of a factor just because of life events for that organization. But in the early 2000s, the 90s and early 2000s, and I went to law school in Topeka, from 2000 to 2003, and that was one of the most active times for the Westboro Baptist Church. And so, I routinely remember, driving around Topeka, and these folks would be protesting, routinely. It'd be daily, weekly at least. At least you'd see them every week. And how about a show of hands? If I say the Westboro Baptist Church, how many people know who that is? Okay, all right, good deal. So we're dealing, and so then you're familiar then with the general nature of the content of their protest signs, and we're aware of this, right? It's very anti-LGBTQ messaging, anti-American messaging. That really kind of rose to the fore after 9/11. And so the basic message of the Westboro Baptist Church is that because Americans don't discriminate against LGBTQ, 9/11 happened. Okay, I just report the news. I don't make it, right? So that's basically the essence of the message that they've been trying to get out. And so one of the ways that they got this message out was by protesting the funerals of servicemen and women who were killed in action in Afghanistan and Iraq in response to 9/11. And so as this started out, you might imagine there was a lot of conflict involved. You've got the you have the two competing rights. You have the respect, the right to respect the fallen and to do the sorts of things that are respectful in that sense. Versus this fundamental right of that's guaranteed under the Bill of Rights, under the Constitution, that there's this First Amendment right to express yourself about politics, which at its core, arguably, that's what the Westboro Baptist Church message is about. So as these sort of protests started to happen more and more routinely, states started to do things to try to limit the protesters. And so in I believe it was in Missouri, is where this case originated from. That I can't remember is a little unfortunate, but in that case, the state passed a statute, a law, that said that funeral protesters, funeral picketers, they could not protest within 500 feet of the funeral service, and they also had limitations about when they could be there before and after. Because, as you might imagine, the Phelps plan originally was, let's show up with a whole group of people, and we'll be there for a long time before and after, and we'll get as close as we can. And so, in the end, this Supreme Court case went up to the United States Supreme Court about whether or not that restriction violated their First Amendment rights. There was also a corollary issue as to that had to do with civil liability that I'm not going to get into. But the main outcome of that case is that the United States Supreme Court established a constitutional protection for hate speech. I mean, that's what it stands for. It stands for the proposition that hate speech, in and of itself, despite the fact that it is offensive and that it is, violates, common decency and those sorts of things, that speech is protected. Now, the government can limit the time, place, and manner of expression. And so that's why it was then constitutional for the state to pass a law that, put limits on how the protests could be. So it's those two sides of the coin, right? You have the protected expression, which I think a lot of us would sort of think to ourselves, that shouldn't be protected expression, right? But it is. But it is protected expression. And because it's protected expression, that means that the government cannot completely ban speakers from expressing those messages. For example, if the state of Missouri had passed a statute that says there is no funeral picketing, you cannot show up at a funeral picketing because the interests of the folks who are celebrating the life of this fallen serviceman are so important that we can limit those, that we can entirely shut down that expression. And that violates the First Amendment. So what we're talking about here is competing rights. How do we balance these competing rights? It is extremely different. It is extremely difficult, especially when the precedent strongly suggests, if not outright holds, I think outright holds is fair, that hate speech is protected expression. So it's very challenging, right? Because we think of ourselves, we want to think of ourselves as a society that's moving forward, progress. And it seems like a setback, doesn't it, to allow that kind of criticism that's so pejoratively based and not based on any sort of merit or anything rational. But the decision that's been made by the courts over the course of decades and was set in motion when the Bill of Rights was enacted, in 1791, the Constitution was ratified in 1787, the Bill of Rights in 1791. What our system of government has decided is that it is the marketplace of ideas is what is important. It is not permissible to decide what the best idea is and shut off all the other ideas. That is what our country has decided, or what the jurisprudence has decided, what the Supreme Court has decided. And it's pretty interesting, isn't it? Because when you go back and you read a lot of these opinions from the 60s and the early 70s where these ideas sort of coalesced, I mean, what I'm thinking when I'm reading those opinions is that I'm thinking that the justices are thinking to themselves, you know what? Sure, there's a lot of antipathy and racism and hatred in this community, in this sort of speech, but you know what? We have confidence that if we just let all the speech happen, the speech that is most meritorious will rise to the top. I mean, I kind of think that's what they were thinking. Has it played out that way? That's the question we have to ask ourselves. Did the marketplace of ideas work? So we know that hate speech is protected expression under the First Amendment because of the Phelps case. What is some other sorts of expression that at first blush shouldn't seem protected but is? Well, very recently in 2023, the Supreme Court ruled that, we're dealing with social media, okay, and the Supreme Court justices, I mean, it's hard to know, how informed about the technology they possibly can be. I mean, just given the realities of age. But I'm not actually sure that factored into this ruling so much as well. I'm not sure I want to speculate why this ruling turned out the way it did. But this case is called Colorado versus Counterman, and in this case, we had a female musician. She was, like a local musician in Colorado, Denver area, I think. And so she'd go out and play. I don't think she had a record contract or anything, but she was just a local musician. And so then she had a fan, quote unquote, a male, who identified her, started to follow her around, and then sent messages to her on Facebook over and over and over and over and over again. Message after message after message after message. So the state of Colorado, the county, the district attorney in the county that she lived in, brought charges against this person, saying, you are harassing this musician. And the case goes all the way up to the Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court finds that because his messages were only vaguely threatening and didn't constitute a true threat, his expression was protected under the First Amendment and he wasn't guilty of harassment, even though he had sent her countless messages that you and I and all of us in this room would consider harassment. Okay? So far, we know that hate speech is protected expression. We know that harassing female musicians is protected expression. What else is protected expression that maybe should be? How about cross-burning? Do we think cross-burning should be protected expression under the First Amendment? Well, the Supreme Court had a really interesting opportunity to resolve that question once, and they did it in the course of deciding two separate factual instances in the same case. Let's see if you can figure out which one. Well, I'll spoil it a little bit, okay? They wouldn't, FYI, the court doesn't do things twice if it's going to be the same outcome, okay? FYI. So we have two fact scenarios, and I want you to try to figure out which one is protected, all right? Now, the first instance involved a KKK rally. So we've got a KKK rally out in the country, and a neighbor who is witnessing the KKK rally calls the police, or the county sheriff, I think, and says, these folks over here are burning a cross at their KKK rally, and they need to be charged with the anti-cross burning statute, this is in Virginia. Virginia has a long history of cross burning. Not every state has anti-cross burning statutes. In the South, it's more likely Virginia has one. Okay, so the sheriff shows up, and they arrest these KKK members who are burning the cross out in the field. The KKK members challenged they fought back against the criminal prosecution, and they argued that their expression was protected. Should their expression have been protected? And if their expression was protected, why should it have been? Well, the answer has to do with the nature of the communication. If you're out in a field and you're standing around with a bunch of like-minded people and you're burning a cross and you're dancing around and doing stuff that people do at KKK rallies, where's the threat? How is anyone threatened by that? We have the neighbor who is offended, but when the police asked her if she felt physically threatened, she said, no, I don't feel threatened, because she was, sitting in front of her house across the street, right? There was never any physical threat. So, go back to counterman. No articulable threat because the messages didn't say anything like, I'm going to come kill you. So once again, we've got cross-burning protected. So we got hate speech protected, cross-burning protected, and we have harassment protected. But I'm leaving out one thing because I told you there was a second case at the Supreme Court when they decided the cross-burning issue. So tell me if you think that this amounts to protected speech. So a black family moved to a city in Virginia from California, and they lived there about 6 months, and over the course of that 6 months, weird stuff started to happen. Tires would be deflated, stuff that, to suggest that they weren't welcome, right? That's the sort of the thing that sort of started to happen. And then, and it turned out that their neighbor, one of the black family's neighbor, had decided that he didn't like them. And so he and a friend of his took a cross, went into the yard of the neighbor of the black family, and burned the cross in the yard of the black family. Now, is that protected expression? Correct, it's not. It's not. It's not. And why is that? Because there is a through line, a very clear through line between burning a cross in that situation in front of with the historical impacts of cross burning and the way that we all understand cross burning to be, the fact that that happened in the yard of a black person's house. That was enough for the cross burning statute to have sufficient intent that there was an intent to harm, an intent to harass that made it so that the expression was not protected. But see how you can't even blanketly say in this country that cross-burning isn't protected speech? See, so the Supreme Court had to do that because there was this other case, this older case that really blurred the lines, and so then the Supreme Court took this, in this case I'm talking about 2003, it's called Virginia v. Black. So far we've talked about Snyder versus Phelps, we've talked about Colorado versus Counterman, and now we're talking about Virginia v. Black. Those three cases, I think, really help to illustrate how difficult it is to regulate expression in this country when you have the First Amendment. I mean, you have got to be able to draw a very clear through line. And most of the cases that I'm going to be talking about today and that kind of shape the way that we understand this, 9 times out of 10, and sort of like in these cases I've talked about, it's where this offensive or untowed sort of expression ends up being protected. So it's really important to realize that when you're trying to understand what the First Amendment is, the very first step is to realize that the categories of protected expression are extremely narrow, and the presumption is that speech is going to be protected under the First Amendment.
Yeah, the First Amendment can obviously be a very complicated issue, it seems. But could you just talk a little bit about what some of the common dynamics of free expression are on college campuses, what that can look like on a college campus?
For sure. So, let's see. So the way to try to get to the bottom of this issue, and I'm really going to try very, very hard not to cause everyone to pass out with sleep here, because this legalese, and it does get a little dicey. I'm going to try to start from the beginning of what I think is the most important concept to answer your question, which is that when you're at a public school and you're attending a public school and administrators are running a public school, a university like this one, that they're the government, right? The university is the government. The university is the government, and so that means that that they are state actors, and the First Amendment controls. One of the foundational elements of the jurisprudence that comes from the First Amendment is that the government can tend to regulate expression as long as the regulation is content neutral. Content neutral. What does it mean to be content neutral? I was thinking about this on the way over here about how to kind of explain this in a way that would make some sense. What the courts say about content neutral is that if the state makes a decision based on the fact that it disagrees with the speaker's expression, that's not content neutral. Right? It's viewpoint discrimination. If you are saying to yourself, I'm going to make this decision because I don't like the content of what somebody is saying, I disagree with it politically, morally, whatever, that is a content-based decision. And under the First Amendment, the government cannot make content-based decisions. All of the decisions that the government makes must be content neutral. And so the way that this is most commonly comes up in a college campus situation is when you've got a controversy, when a student group wants to invite a speaker that others, and perhaps the majority of students, would consider controversial. That is when all of these issues kind of come to a head. And so when you're a student and you want to bring in a speaker and you're part of an organization that wants to bring in a speaker that's going to talk about a current event, some sort of political issue, that's when this comes up. And as students, one thing I really want to be clear about is that you should not hesitate. You should not hesitate to bring in whatever kind of speakers that you can. And why is that? Because the role of the university, the primary role of the university, is to house dissenting opinions. It's not for the university to say, I am choosing this as the quote-unquote right or most meritorious, or this idea wins out in the marketplace. In private universities, not much, it's not credible to do that either, because in a private university setting, you have a contractual obligation, and most students who go to a private school are looking for a similar experience to a public school. So even though the First Amendment doesn't apply in that setting, because it's a private school and not the government, this concept still kind of carries over. So the key when you are a student is to make sure that you're not thwarted in your efforts to bring in any of these controversial speakers, because it is the university's responsibility to figure out how to go about managing that in a way that is going to keep everyone safe. Because that's really what this comes down to, isn't it? Is the safety of students. How many have you, this is a while ago now, but it was, I think, the seminal moment in college safety, or in college, in speakers on, controversial speakers on college, and that was when the University of California at Berkeley hosted Free Speech Week. I want to say it was in 2014, I think, and they invited speakers including Milo Yiannopoulos and Ben Shapiro and Ann Coulter and other conservative folks. And if you Google that, what you'll see is the news stories that were reported and the television coverage of riots and explosions and all kinds of violence that accompanied that. And as a result of that, the university spent $4 million, I just read today, $4 million providing what turned out to be pretty ineffective security for that event. And I think that incident, and again, you should Google Milo at Berkeley. Just Google it. And that's the seminal experience that those of us of a certain age have when it comes to free speech on college campuses. And So that instance just really illustrates how important it is for the university to understand that the security issue is real, and not only the security issue, but the idea that if a student group is going to bring in a controversial speaker, the university has to do everything that it can within reason to allow for that speaker to be, for protests against that speaker to be able to happen, peacefully and but also meaningfully. There was another good example, a very concrete example that I'm familiar with is there was a federal district court case in Nebraska in 2022. This exact sort of thing happened where a conservative student group wanted to platform I believe he was an anti-evolutionist type of scholar, and so so this right-wing group was going to bring this guy in, and so the right-wing group, then the student group, they go to the student senate or whatever organization it is that oversees the ability of students to bring these speakers in, and they and this group, this supervisory group, they say, well, they say two things, both of which get them in trouble, and the first is that we're not going to allow this speaker to come because we don't allow speakers to discuss political issues on campus. Now, what are the odds that no student group ever has had somebody come to campus that didn't speak about it, right? It's totally pretext, right? Completely and totally pretext. And then the other thing that they told the students was that if you bring this controversial speaker, then you, the student group, are responsible for bringing in another speaker to give an opposing viewpoint, so that there's counter speech that's actually happening, but then they're putting the onus on the student group to actually do that. I mean, that did not go well. The university, there was the judge in that case found that the university violated First Amendment rights, and there was a settlement that ended up being made to the student group. And what it really illustrates is what the university shouldn't be doing, and it shouldn't be doing the things that Nebraska did in that instance. And instead, what it should be doing is, I read just recently that what UCLA does, obviously is a different situation. UCLA, large university in West Coast, and also has this history of controversial speeches. Although Berkeley and UCLA are different, still in the same conference, Pac-10. I don't even know. So anyway, that I read that that UCLA. So what they do is they set a budget for how to handle security and how to wall off protesters, and how to make it so that controversial speakers can actually so that the students that the First Amendment rights aren't violated when the controversial speakers arrive. So when you're the university, these are the sort of issues you've got to be thinking about. You've got to think about, how can I keep the students safe? Because you know that you're going to have to, the controversial speaker is going to come. I mean, they're going to come. If the student group wants the controversial student or the speaker to come, and the arrangements can be made between the student organization and the controversial speaker, I mean, it's going to happen. So as the university, it's really a losing battle to try to say, oh well, this is wrong, or this shouldn't happen. This doesn't represent the university, right? That isn't going to work. Instead, what the university has got to do is make it so the security measures are in place, but most importantly, that there is a channel for opposition, for protest. If there are folks that want to speak out against the controversial speaker, then what the university is going to have to do is make it so that, for example, if the speaker is at here, for example, if the controversial speaker happens to be in the Dole Center, what would be an appropriate time, place, and manner restriction that would limit protesters. Well, certainly you couldn't have protesters standing right here. Protesters couldn't be standing with signs right here because that would defeat the whole purpose of having the program in the first place. But certainly it would be appropriate for the university to designate perhaps the area out front here on the patio, and maybe not even the whole area, because you can't be, because the interests include making it so that people can still get in and out, ingress, egress. You can't create a fire hazard, that sort of thing. But you have to strike a balance between keeping the community and the event and the premises safe, while also recognizing that there's a First Amendment right that the university has to protect to allow opposition to these controversial speakers. So this is a very complicated, right? It isn't just a matter of, oh, I want this person to come in, and it's certainly not a matter of, oh, I don't want this person to come in. It can't be either of those things. It has to be about striking a balance and making it so that the First Amendment rights of both the controversial speaker and those who would protest the controversial speaker are respected.
Okay. Yeah, so we've talked a little bit about some of the public-facing side of the free expression on campus. I want to narrow in and talk a little bit about what can happen between students as well. So one of the largest changes for college students in the past 20 years has been the role of social media in all of our lives, which is the place where a lot of these conversations exist now on campus. So how would you say that social media has impacted these campus free expression environments? Should people be able to say whatever they want online without consequence?
Well, I think the Counterman case supports that, unfortunately, right? I think that, the key is if there, the line, so I didn't quite finish my either the analysis of the Counterman or of the cross-burning cases, because I should have finished that. And what the Supreme Court was really trying to do was trying to figure out the circumstances under which threatening speech would not be protected. That's really what this is about. And so what the court has done is they've come up with this phrase called a true threat. What is a true threat? True threats are unprotected under the Constitution. So the burning of the cross in the neighbor's yard, that constituted a true threat. But burning the cross in a ritualistic thing as a KKK rally out in the country, what was not a true threat. So when it comes to evaluating the extent to which expression is problematic, that's definitely the first thing that you want to think about, is how can I articulate this message that I'm getting as an actual threat to my person, and do I feel that threat? That has to be kind of the threshold, and especially if it's in the context of maybe heated discussions over policy or something in class. I think the really wrong approach would be to, and I think again, Counterman indicates that it's the wrong approach to jump to conclusions, to ascribe a threatening motive to everything that comes through a social media feed. That isn't going to work. That ends up to be in some ways it can be a cry wolf kind of a situation. And so that's of course what you don't want to do, right? The last thing that a victim wants to have happen is to not be taken seriously. And so the key is to be able to have the evidence that shows that there is a true threat, and that something needs to happen to protect you, the recipient, of this information, from that true threat. So that's the starting point. And again, I was doing some reading in advance of this thing to prepare myself for this, and I was reading material that goes right to this question. And civility, it really comes down to trying to give people the benefit of the doubt as much as possible. Of course, that's extremely difficult. You give people the benefit of the doubt one time too many, and then they show up with a knife at your apartment. So I get it. But the unfortunate, I mean, I don't know if it's unfortunate or fortunate, I suppose. It kind of was where you are on the free speech versus, versus the true threat continuum. But it's just, I will just say that to get law enforcement involved or try to get some sort of administrative sanction against a fellow student for their expression, it's really fraught unless you can clearly show that there's some kind of threat. Harassment is also unprotected expression, but because of counterman, it becomes harder to be able to figure out what actual harassment is. Because again, in that case, we have our musician who received all kinds of messages that she didn't appreciate, yet she loses in the Supreme Court. So it's a very tough line to find. And in the end, it's just very difficult because the whole idea of academic freedom and the idea of being able to mature and grow in an academically nurturing community, which is what a university is. You're going to intrinsically, there's going to be these times where things are said that are not appreciated by everybody. And but I think it's fair to say that until that crosses into a true threat, I think it's hard to regulate that. Just in response to your question generally, though, and this doesn't just apply to students. Every state has you can get a restraining order, right? Protection from abuse and protection from stalking. There's uniform laws that exist in every state in the country that are all basically the same. And so those are the ones that are available that most commonly would protect people, boyfriend, girlfriend, breakup kind of a thing, get a restraining order, the person doesn't stop coming around, that sort of thing. But that mechanism can also be used to protect you, in the event that you think that there's harassment or harassment or some kind of true threat that you're feeling. So I guess to answer your question, the administrative process is not the only process that's available to students. And I think that while the university might be reluctant to want to punish folks for their expression, especially given this precedent, this recent precedent that I've been talking about, it's less likely that sort of thing would trickle down into a local district court judge. So I guess what I would so the way I'd respond to that question is that there are a lot of avenues to try to protect yourself, and so I would, and in the end, how credible is the threat? I mean, that's really what it comes down to, because even in front of a district court judge who doesn't necessarily care about politics or anything at the university, I mean, you're still going to have to illustrate that the threat was enough to meet the level that's set by the law. So there are avenues to be able to protect yourself from offensive expression. I think in general, the idea is to have a thick skin as much as possible, but keeping in mind that there are risks that come along with that too, and as such, there are other mechanisms to try to address that and stay safe.
Yeah, so I think that we'll have time for probably about one more question tonight, and I think one takeaway that students should have from this is ways that they can have better conversations with people on campus and be able to kind of contribute to a more productive free expression environment on their college campuses. So what would you say that students here today can do to create more productive conversations and a more conducive free expression environment on campus in their classrooms and in these protest situations that you've shared? Sure.
The key, I just really think the key is patience and tolerance. I really do. Especially among young people, the idea has to be that, just because I don't like this point of view doesn't mean that I should disregard it. When you are in this formative educational time in your lives, I just really think that it is not in anyone's best interest to immediately shut down discourse. By the same token, perhaps a response to that ethos is to sort of self-censor. Is there self-censoring that goes on? I'd just rather self-censor than get into a conflict. I can understand that point of view. I think that the best way to go about communicating, though, is to be as clear as possible, and also to find aspects of whatever it is that you're trying to convey or convince somebody of. Like, what's your best argument? What's objectively provable about what you're trying to say? And be able to recognize the difference between something that can actually be provable as true or false versus something that's just a matter of opinion. Because differences of opinion, if you've got a different opinion, it's that, okay, we'll agree to disagree, you go your separate ways, that's a little bit like shutting somebody down, right? Because, we just didn't get along. Well, that's different, though, isn't it, from discussions on the merits about something. And trying to engage, to actually figure out the difference between, some sort of pejorative, dismissive comment, and that might be appropriate under some circumstances, but wouldn't be appropriate if the person that you're talking to is trying to make a valid point. In the end, it really just does come down to do unto others as you would have them do unto you. I mean, that's really what it is. And trying to give people the benefit of the doubt as much and as long as possible, I've found is really helpful. And to the extent that you do disagree with them, and if you want to prove that you're right and they're wrong, I mean, the best thing to do is what's the most narrow issue that you can prove that you've got a slam dunk, and then can you get that person that you're disagreeing with to agree with you on that one small thing, and if that happens, then maybe that achieves the rapport that you were trying to accomplish.
Okay, well, thank you so much. Now I'd like to open it up to the people in the audience for questions. So please raise your hand if you have a question, and I'll direct a student worker with a microphone to you, and try to limit your question to a couple of sentences so we have time to get to everyone that has one. So.
Hi, my name is Joel. You mentioned that, it is the case that First Amendment fundamentally protects people in the U.S. from suppression from the government or its agencies, broadly speaking. And so I have a question about proxies, and here's my case. If in response to a directive or threat from the government, a private entity, say a tech entity, suppresses or shuts down speech or some specific discourse, to what extent would that count or fall under a First Amendment violation? Or more clearly, how is proxy or coercion or a directive by the government managed or attended to in examinations of free speech?
Sure, that's a really good question. So basically the idea is, what evidence can you show, or what evidence is there that whichever actor, purportedly a private actor, are they actually acting for the state? Are they actually a state actor? What evidence can you show of that? And there's, in different states and different areas of law, there's different ways to kind of articulate that. One of the ways to articulate it is the extent to which an actor is an instrumentality of the government. In other words, could the government accomplish its goal without this entity? If not, that entity is an instrumentality. And so then you've got, and so the question always comes down to the facts, because a pure private contractor, could probably argue, well, look, I'm not a state actor. I'm just working as a contractor. I'm not carrying out any specific ethos of the government. I'm just doing my job. So there's a balance to be struck there. There's a difference between a mere vendor and an instrumentality. So the question when you're dealing with a private actor that's claiming that they are just a vendor or have an arm's length relationship with the government, the key is to identify the facts that prove that the private entity actually has a close relationship with the government. So how would you go about doing that? How is the leader of this private organization appointed or elected or hired? What relationship does that person or the leaders of this organization have with the government? How closely connected is the government's, our government objectives to what this private organization is carrying out? Those are the more facts that you have to demonstrate that close relationship, the better chance that you'll have of being able to illustrate and show that the private actor is actually the government.
Okay, thank you. Do we have any more questions in the audience? Nathan over there.
I was wondering, have you ever had to defend speech that you didn't agree with? And if not, how would you approach that?
Oh yeah, I mean really, what it comes down to when you're a lawyer, the chances that your client has done everything in an impeccably right way is about zero, right? I mean, the whole thing is that it takes two to tango. I mean, that's the whole thing. I mean, criminal case, civil case. I mean, the odds that one party is an innocent angel. I mean, I guess it has happened. It's never happened to me. So this is what it is. I mean, you're never going to be in a situation where, well, most of the time you're not going to be in a situation where you can agree with everything that your client did or said. And so the key is always to minimize the negative impact for the client. How can you what arguments can you make to show that to maybe convince the other side and or the judge that what the client said wasn't problematic. By the same token, though, you can't ignore things about your case. So you're going to have to always, one way or another, you're going to have to confront the problems with your case. And one thing that they say in law school that I really do believe in, and I think that this applies generally, is that if there are bad facts for your case, for your position, for your argument, for anything that you're trying to prove, I think it's best to just come out with those. Okay, even given these bad facts, my client can still do this, and that's the way I always do it. Is you can't, because it's never going to be perfect. So how can you make chicken salad out of that's the key. And so I think the most important thing is to not be set in your ways in terms of kind of drawing a conclusion about your client. Because the more you think about it, or the more I think about the issues that that are confronting my clients, then I'll think about other avenues or ways to mitigate the problem that their expression posed. So disagree. Are you going to disagree with what your clients say? I mean, 100% you are. It's just like in a criminal defense. You have to believe in. Of course, I don't do criminal defense, so I mean, I think there is a moral quandary that comes into this. I'm not saying that there isn't, but if you're doing criminal defense, how do you defend somebody who's been accused of rape, or child abuse, Well, you've got to put yourself in a position of let's make sure that all of the procedural safeguards, are followed, and let's make sure that the evidence that was gathered by the police was done so in a way that didn't violate the client's constitutional rights. So it comes down to framing a way to succeed that isn't necessarily dependent on exactly what your client did, because you can usually figure out a way to kind of shift the issue, to make it so that it's somehow to your client's advantage. So, if you take the case, you can't give up on your client, and you can't just be like, well, I didn't like what you said, so I guess I'm not going to do this. No, you got to try to figure out a way to sell it.
Thank you. Do we have any more questions in the audience? Okay. Well, I guess that'll be the last question that we'll have this evening.
We did have one more, I think.
Oh, one more? Oh, I'm sorry. Joel again.
Thank you. This was my second question. The way you described it and with the specific instances or cases we spoke about, I got the impression, and I may be wrong, that the First Amendment works in a sort of overriding principle wherein whilst there may be other violations within an action on a protest, it may be impossible to, or it may be difficult to to, I don't say dissolve, but make a definite resolution if it does not, if we can use the First Amendment to almost like a blanket over it, then we can't address maybe specific, or this is a property issue, or this is they cross the line, or when we protesters were in a place they were not meant to be. Is that actually the case with the First Amendment? Is the First Amendment necessarily an overriding blanket-like principle?
Well, I think it is. I mean, I think that, especially when you're talking about student protests, I mean, that's the most important thing, and because it's the First Amendment right that the protester is exercising. And so then if you are the government and you're trying to limit that expression, then you have to do so under content neutral means, time, place, and manner. So, a good example of that, this will be the last thing. A good example of that is if so there was a question, I can't even remember now when this was, a year or two ago. There was a question about whether the extent to which camping ordinances that prevented, that prevent students from pitching tents, whether those sorts of ordinances could be used to shut down the pro-Palestinian protest that was going on in front of Strong Hall. And so the answer to that question is 100%, right? The use of the content neutral camping ordinance is appropriate because it is content neutral and it is not targeting it's not targeting any particular expression. It's not saying we are shutting you down because you have a pro-Palestinian message. We are shutting you down because you're trying to pitch tents in front of Strong Hall, and we have an ordinance that's content neutral that says that you can't do that. So I think to answer your question, the easiest way to answer your question is that whenever expression is involved, both the speaker and the government, to the extent that it's the providing the forum for that speech, I mean, there has to be a constant dialogue and thought process that goes on between all of the competing issues that are involved, and that's why when you have controversial speakers or when you have protests on campus, there has to be the opportunity. The university is the repository for all of this conflicting these conflicting messages. And so I think the only way to resolve those fairly is to be applying the First Amendment prophylactically and in advance.
Thank you. Do we have any more questions? Try not to miss people this time. Okay. Well, that'll be the last question that we have this evening. Could we give Max another round of applause?
Thank you.
Yeah, so thank you all for attending this evening. Don't forget about our first SAB meeting. That's on February 3rd at 5:30 p.m. here at the Dole Institute, and Simon's back there. On Thursday, we're going to be holding our Elizabeth Dole Women in Leadership Lecture, also right here at the Dole Institute with former National Archivist Colleen Shogan. So you won't want to miss that. Thank you all for attending again tonight, and I hope you have a great night.
Thanks a lot.